Welcome back. I'm happy to introduce our skills session today on stakeholder engagement. Jasmine McAdams is our presenter. She's a graduate student research assistant at Berkeley Lab. She's currently earning her doctorate at the University of California, Berkeley. Her research addresses electric power system planning and resilience, stakeholder engagement, and utility regulation. And previously, she worked at the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. So we have a lot of Public Utility Commission reps on the call today. She has a really strong background there. And she's got a master's degree from the University of California in energy and resources and a bachelor's from Brown. So again, we encourage you to ask your questions. You can raise your hand or just unmute yourself. And also feel free, as always, to share comments or ask questions in the chat.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I will now share my screen. That up. All right. And is this coming through okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, thank you so much for that introduction. So as Lisa mentioned, I'll be kind of providing a very high level overview of stakeholder engagement, and we'll be doing a bit of a interactive activity. So hopefully folks are down for that. You'll just need, I'll send you a link a little bit later, and you'll just need to like hop online to do the interactive activity. And then I'll share a few key resources and then take some questions at the end. Okay. So stakeholder engagement is something that's really central to a lot of planning, and in particular, energy planning. And it's something that can happen really anywhere along the energy planning cycle. So if you look at this figure on the right, you can see what that energy planning cycle might entail. And this is just one example of this. And so that can be anywhere from identifying and convening stakeholders all the way to maybe even evaluating and measuring what the impact of a particular decision is. And when we refer to stakeholders, I also want to make it clear that this can be really anybody who is impacted by a decision or might be interested in a decision. And it's a pretty broad kind of category of folks that we're referring to. And stakeholder engagement, particularly in the energy sector, can be something that is formal as required by regulation or certain statutes. So for example, if you're with a Public Utilities Commission, that might look like having committee members or stakeholders intervene formally into a particular docket, or it can be informal. Maybe that is something that is exploratory through like technical workshops or other kind of more public-facing events. And in addition to that, how stakeholder engagement is planned and implemented is really important. And this is important because, I think that just like the way that we're kind of interacting with individuals and the way that we're considering their input has a really big impact on the way that these policies and programs will actually shake out in the end. And there are a number of different frameworks that different organizations have developed to sort of understand and communicate around stakeholder engagement. One of my favorite frameworks is this spectrum of community engagement ownership. It's something that was adopted by the International Association of Public Participation's spectrum of public involvement. And really what it does is it shows you how community engagement can really occur along a spectrum from kind of little interaction to really ownership and a greater delegation of power. The way that I like to use this is if I am designing a particular stakeholder engagement, with a community or with an agency, I like to think about what some of my goals might be. So if my goals are to just keep a community informed, that might fall over here within this kind of informed part of the spectrum. And that if you look down a little bit further, you can also see the specific activities that might be associated with informing a community or stakeholders. And so That might just be some simple exercises like developing fact sheets, maybe having open houses where you make specific announcements or town halls, things of that nature. And if you move a little bit further down, you can also get a sense of how resources might be allocated toward this particular activity. So you might have some level of kind of higher level of system administration, as well as a little bit lower amount of effort going towards promotions and publicity. And then we move to the other side of the spectrum. We're looking at examples of activities that really are, I think, fostering a lot more engagement and I would say even like co-production with the stakeholders that you're working with. So this might involve some things such as like community-driven planning or consensus building. Something that I use in my own research is participatory action research. And this is a way of doing research where you involve communities or stakeholders along every single step. And so they help you identify a research question and all the way to evaluating its impacts. I also think that this is a really helpful framework that can be applied to the context of utility planning or other energy decisions at the state level. So it's not something that is only kind of isolated to academia, but I think has a really great place outside of academia as well. And so I want to show this to you as well, because it's something that will come up a little bit later as I'm talking through the interactive activity that we'll be doing. All right. So as I mentioned on the first slide, the way that we do stakeholder engagement is really important. And there are a few principles I wanted to quickly talk through. But if there's anything on this slide that folks feel like is missing, I would love for you to just add it to the chat. Because I think, this can look like a lot of different ways for people. And if you have experience doing stakeholder engagement, you might want to share as well what some of these things might be. So the first kind of principle I have here is to design engagement from the perspective of belonging, really meaning that we want to lower barriers to participation. So some ways of doing that might look like ensuring that we are using different kind of inclusive meeting times or meeting formats. If we're meeting online, do we have a way to provide transcripts or captions? If you're working with a community or stakeholders that speak other languages besides English, are there ways to translate some of that material, whether it's written material or even having a translator on site to ensure that everybody who's in the room understands what's happening? In addition to that, I think when we talk about belonging, this also includes for folks who are doing in-person events, thinking about how people are actually going to get to the venue. Something that may seem very simple, but especially in urban environments where a lot of folks might not have vehicles, I think it's important to consider whether the venue that you're selecting is near public transit or other forms of transportation, not only having a personally owned vehicle. The second principle I want to add here is to reach out to stakeholders who are most impacted by a decision to make sure that they are both aware of the process that is ongoing and also able to actually to attend or to kind of work together with you through that process. And so this might involve something called stakeholder mapping, and we will do a brief exercise covering stakeholder mapping in the interactive portion of today's session. Another thing that I think is also tied into building a culture of belonging within these types of engagements is to include opportunities for knowledge building, especially for non-technical stakeholders. Some great examples of this that I have seen are some public utilities commissions might offer sort of 101 webinars or sessions or even online sort of written materials for folks to understand what is it that a public utilities commission actually does. What is actually involved in utility regulation, how are rates set? And these are some really fundamental pieces of information that I think help communities and stakeholders all be able to kind of start on the same page as they're going into these different engagements and planning. In addition to that, I also think that these opportunities for knowledge building can also be built in just through maybe community activities and doing outreach that is maybe a bit broader, but is also enabling this type of learning at a broader scale. And number 4, this is something that maybe seems pretty obvious, but planning often and iteratively is really helpful to ensuring a smooth process. I think it's even better when you can involve some of these stakeholders in that process itself of like developing that stakeholder outreach plan. And when I say iteratively, this might look like kind of having certain checkpoints within your engagement process, whether that's developing a report or an evaluation of a particular program, but having those checkpoints where you kind of build in flexibility and are allowing yourself and your organization to kind of shift what you're doing kind of on the fly. And so this might be just having check-in conversations with the stakeholders that you're convening, saying, hey, are we meeting at the appropriate times? Are there people here that we think are missing? You know, are there things about the facilitation that are or are not going so well that we can adapt moving forward? 5th is to be really clear in communicating the scope of the engagement and what concerns it can and cannot address. I think this is really important if you're working in the energy space. As some of you are probably very aware, energy is such a cross-cutting topic that many people are very passionate about, especially when it comes to the way it impacts their personal lives. You know, however, I think that different states and different commissions or utilities sort of interpret their responsibilities a bit differently, or their mandates a bit differently in terms of how they might address certain social concerns or other externalities that are related to energy, but maybe not core to the utilities kind of obligation to their service territory. And I think when we're thinking about that, before we really begin an engagement process, I think it's really helpful to outline to the folks that you're engaging with what it is that this engagement can and cannot do, so that people are all on the same page, and that you're not getting a lot of comments that just aren't really related to what this is. Something that I also think is really helpful is to, you know, if there are things that people feel like they are very passionate about and want addressed, but this is just not the right venue for them, is to find what is. Are there partners or other colleagues that you can kind of refer them to help make sure that they are being heard somewhere, that their concerns aren't being completely ignored. And I see there are some things coming into the chat, so I'll just read a few of those out loud. Let's see. All right, so Emily says, make sure that the means of communication is impactful for stakeholders. They should know exactly how your decisions are impacting them and why that matters for them. Totally. I think that goes along with the last thing I was saying about communicating the scope as well. Camille adds that I think this is inclusive and creating belonging, but thinking through any barriers in trust in the communities you're engaged with due to historical events or relationships with the leading entity. I think first working to rebuild that trust is critical for meaningful engagement. I think that is a great point to add, is to really be aware of the historical context. And when we're thinking about why certain groups might not be engaging, who might be really interested or impacted by a decision, that's a really great place to kind of look a little bit more into, you know, doing online research or just talking to community members about, you know, what can be done to kind of start that conversation and moving towards more a greater sense of belonging. And I think that's also connected to Kelly's comment about doing research to understand local context and history with regard to energy or relevant industries in advance. And then lastly, we have a comment here by Emily about assessing how the stakeholder engagement goes, so you can work with your methods and improve or personalize it for next time. 100%. I think that ties back into thinking about how to do this iteratively, but also I think identifying specific metrics or measures that sort of demonstrate success for you or your organization. Are you looking for, breadth and engaging as many different groups of people as possible, or are you looking for depth and you really want to have as many interactions that fall on the right side of the public engagement spectrum as possible? I think there are different ways that you can tailor those specific metrics, but I think knowing that ahead of time and tying those back into maybe the values of your organization or the objectives of that particular process will be a great starting point for getting the foundation to actually evaluate what a stakeholder engagement process can look like. So thank you all so much for providing those principles, and feel free to add any more if those come up as we're moving on to the exercise and some of the resources that I'll share a bit later. Okay, so we're now going to move to a stakeholder mapping activity. And what stakeholder mapping is just a way to sort of organize different groups of stakeholders to help you understand what strategy you are going to use to either recruit them into a process that you have, or how you want to engage them specifically. Really, it's a helpful tool to do a lot of things, so it's quite flexible. And what you essentially do is you identify the type of matrix or kind of what sort of characteristics you want to track or use. And so what I have here is an example of a stakeholder influence and interest matrix, which is a pretty common matrix that is used. If you look up stakeholder mapping, you're most likely going to find this as kind of the most popular form. And what this does is it allows you to graph, and it's not an exact science by any means, but you'll be graphing the level of influence that a stakeholder might have in the way that they can actually influence that particular decision that you're working through, as well as their interest. So, to what extent might they be interested, whether it's because they are required to be interested in that topic, or because they are going to be highly impacted by whatever the outcome will be of that process. And then once you have mapped all of those different groups out, and you can also do this at the individual level as well, folks will fall within one of the 4 quadrants. And this is just a helpful way to sort of think about, okay, if someone falls maybe in the upper right quadrant, so that collaborate section, that might tell you that, hey, these are the folks that you really want to be working the closest with. If someone's falling into the upper left quadrant, those are some folks that you want to keep kind of satisfied or aware of what's going on, but maybe you're not working as closely with them on a day-to-day basis. Folks who are falling in the lower left quadrant that are more kind of lower influence and lower interest side, you probably don't owe a ton to them in terms of the level of engagement, but it's still important to just at least keep them informed. So falling more on the left side of the public engagement spectrum. And then lastly, if folks are falling on the lower right side, those are folks you also want to keep informed, but there might be some opportunities to tap into that kind of well of knowledge if there are specific, maybe subject matter area questions or questions about their communities that might be helpful to know to inform the decision that you're making. So, I don't think there's any real wrong way to do this, but it's a really helpful exercise also to make sure that the folks who are on your engagement team have a common understanding of who is going to be in the room or who you want to be in the room, and what barriers or kind of specific what barriers might exist or what specific strategies you can use as you're sort of coming up with your plan. And so what I'm going to have you do now is we're going to walk through a brief activity of doing this type of stakeholder mapping. And so Lisa just dropped a virtual whiteboard, which I'll have you join. And what we're going to do is just go through a very, this is a fictional scenario, but not something that I think is not relevant in this time. It's something that we're seeing more and more interest in. So perhaps some of you have already kind of encountered a situation like this, or will encounter one in your work moving forward. But we're going to take a particular scenario dealing with the growth of new large loads. So Acme State, which is a fictional state for the purposes of this exercise, is interested in attracting new large loads for economic development. The governor's office has formed a working group of all relevant state agencies to explore ways to quickly interconnect and serve new large loads while balancing any potential impacts to other businesses and residents. Some organizations and residents have raised questions about the allocation of costs for new infrastructure that's needed to serve these new large loads, grid reliability, land use, water consumption, and air quality. And so this working group is interested in convening stakeholder engagement sessions to gather perspectives from affected groups. And so what I want folks to do now is to join this virtual whiteboard, and I will actually stop sharing my screen and share the whiteboard instead. And if anyone's having any issue doing that, please let me know in the chat.
We've got a number of folks in.
Okay, great. I can see some mice moving, so that's great. All right, so what we're gonna do is I wanna give you about, let's see what time it is. Okay, I'll give folks about 5 minutes to independently, what you're gonna do is you're gonna look at these sticky notes that are over here on the left side. And you can think of as many stakeholder groups as you can. And I just want you to add, and these can be like fake organizations or examples of real organizations or just the type of stakeholder. And I want you to brainstorm what types of stakeholder groups might be interested in this type of kind of large load growth scenario. And just like type those in. You can also copy and paste the sticky notes if you run out of room or if there's not enough. And then once you do that, we will, as a group, kind of go through and try and place each of these on the spectrum, and we can talk through that. But let's give folks until 1:34 to add as many organizations as possible.
And Jasmine, they can just go to the tab on the left, right, to choose a sticky note if they want.
Yes, yeah, you don't have, yeah, exactly. You can add a new sticky note. There's a little tab there that says sticky note when you hover over it, or you can just copy and paste a blank one. And if anyone, for some reason, is not able to access this, if you want to chat me just some examples of stakeholder groups, I'll add those in.
Hey, Jasmine,
Yes.
do you mind highlighting the difference between influence and interest in this context a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So really what we mean by influence is these are how much decision-making power, right, those particular stakeholders might have in, whatever decision you're kind of negotiating in that engagement process. So if you are thinking about like the folks who are going to approve permits, they probably have the most power in this particular scenario. Whereas interest might be who are the folks who are maybe like CBOs that might be directly impacted or engaging on these types of issues, or these might be folks who whose bottom line is going to be impacted or who rely on the same type of resources at these large loads. So it's more so based off of not so much the decision-making power, but the actual kind of level or the degree to which they will be impacted by these decisions.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I see some folks are moving ahead and adding their stakeholders to the matrix, which is great, and we can talk through that a bit more for folks who might not fully understand what's going on. But this looks great. It looks like I forgot to put access labels, so let me do that real quick. Cool. I'll give folks one more minute. Okay, great. Feel free to keep moving stuff, but I will start just kind of talking through what I'm seeing so far. And it looks like, as I said earlier, there are no wrong answers here. But I think that the way that I'm seeing at least the first, the top right quadrant, the collaborate quadrant, kind of move looks pretty accurate to me. So I see things like the Utility Commission, the local Department of Environmental Quality, land use and city planners. I see trade associations, municipal governments, planning divisions, native tribes. I'm curious if anyone maybe wants to share. There's a few things that are kind of right at the intersection. So, for example, I see native tribes. Does anyone want to share, whoever put that one there, why they did that and why they made that decision?
Yeah, I
Either
can share.
go ahead.
Um, there's definitely want to involve tribes in informing and consultation. But depending on the situation, um, there could be a level of like how much involvement um that could be decided too.
Yeah, definitely. So are you saying like, like there's a level that could be maybe burdensome?
Yeah, I guess I was like, there would be a level too burdensome to include in every single decision. So as long as like definitely keeping informed is like the goal. Um, but
Great. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that also reminds me of this concept called decision or engagement fatigue. Which is basically this idea that like it's possible that you have so many decisions that are really impacting a lot of people, and if we're doing this like high level of community engagement every single time, some groups or some communities might really feel like it's a bit too much for them. They don't have the time, they don't have the capacity to continue to engage at that high level every single time. And I think to kind of mitigate that, something that you can do or think about doing are to kind of combine different types of engagement that you're doing. So maybe partnering with other agencies that maybe are working on similar issues and finding opportunities to just do kind of one series of events or one event that allows you to meet multiple goals. Another thing is to identify additional resources or leverage additional resources that can help different parties kind of get involved in processes. One example of this that's available in a number of states, specifically to involve them in utility regulation processes, is intervenor compensation. which is essentially funding that allows certain interveners who are formal interveners in a proceeding to have funding for either hiring an expert or to really just fund their time in a particular decision. And not every state has this, but if you Google intervener compensation, there's some examples and lists available of what states have that type of program. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. But yeah, I see a lot of kind of more government entities in that top right quadrant. If we move to the top left quadrant, the keep satisfied or the inform and consult groups of folks, I see here low income residents. I see kind of a bit of the labor unions, farmers and ranchers, small and local businesses are sort of following, I think, kind of across the whole matrix. We also have local community activist groups, as well as commercial energy users and economic development councils. And I think these are all great, and I think fall pretty well here. Does anyone who added something here want to add or share a little bit about why they did that?
I can share if you want.
Okay, yes, please, thank you.
Yeah, so I added both the low income residents and the small local businesses to this general area. And what I was generally thinking of was just the idea, like, for example, low income residents, they're going to be pretty heavily impacted by any large loads that come in the area, both in terms of the cost of energy that happens, but also potentially in terms of land use and air quality. But they're going to have probably the least ability to do something about it, like the least ability to move or to adapt to those changes in prices or anything like that. So I've learned a lot from being here at this host utility that you need to make sure that they're incorporated, but at the same time, you gotta be able to balance that level of what are they able to do, because it's not like they're necessarily the ones who are making the decisions or who are, writing the permits, whatever else. So you gotta make sure that they are considerate of them, but it's not like they are in that position of power, so to say. So they are your customers, they are important. The question is just making sure that they are accounted for just like everybody else.
Right. Awesome. And actually, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your experience. Like in what ways is your organization trying to, what kind of strategies or approaches are you using to engage that group of customers?
Yeah, I've experienced it more kind of on a second hand, not my specific job, but I work with the energy planning team at my municipal utility. And there's a fair amount of low income population here where we have to we hold a lot of community events where we go out and try to have conversations with people in different locations and try to say, hey, here are some resource fairs, here are the things going on, the opportunity, really trying to connect people. And we have a few programs that are essentially meant to raise funds for people who can't afford their energy bills and trying to account for that. And there's, I believe what's called, I don't remember it. It's like Energy 40, Justice 40. There's that, it's a larger scale program where essentially a lot of funds are trying to go towards those lower incomes. But I've learned from moving over here that that's something that, again, they have less of a noticeable voice just because they have less resources to use, but they are something that is essential for the customer base and as part of the community. So that's in essence what I've been witnessing so far. Does that make sense?
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing. All right. So then we have over here on the bottom right, these are the keep informed groups, and I see residential ratepayers, public interest groups, maybe other large load developers, homeowners, internet service providers, environmental nonprofits, and a bit of maybe the local Fishers Club, or emergency management. Yeah, I think these are great suggestions. I am curious about the residential ratepayers and public interest groups, kind of falling in the keep informed category. Just want to hear why someone might have put them there. I don't know if I can see who did it, but if that was you, feel free to share, but you don't have to. And no worries if not.
Jasmine, in your experience, where
Mhm.
would you have put them?
Yeah, I think I think I might have put them a little bit closer to like the collaborate section. But I think where they are there is like kind of makes sense. You inform and consult them. They might not have as much, influence in the final decision as like the actual commissioners. But I think still these groups can be very influential in some of these decisions. It also probably depends on the type of decision that's being made as well. Another way to think about this type of matrix and how to use this as a tool could be to think about it as very kind of transient, or it's something that changes over time. So maybe what you're doing is before you start a session, you're doing some of this mapping to identify where people are right now. But then as you move through the process, maybe your goal is to get as many people or your target stakeholders into that collaborate section. And so you might have some checkpoints or a way to evaluate like where people are moving as you're moving through the process. Are you achieving your goal of getting more people on one side of the spectrum than the other, and kind of reorganizing it? So this can be a very dynamic tool as well. It doesn't have to be static, and really can be accommodated to fit whatever your needs might be. Yeah, so so for consult and involve, yeah, I think a great place to look for there would be to go back to that like engagement, the public engagement spectrum that I shared a bit earlier. So consulting is a bit deeper than just evolving, where you might kind of work through specific processes. You're doing problem solving together when you're consulting with a different group. Whereas involving, you maybe just like are trying to solicit a couple of comments, but you aren't maybe as accountable to like how you're incorporating their input. Another way to think about it also might be like, are you perhaps even providing compensation for certain groups to work with you? And in that case, usually that tends to fall more on the right side of the spectrum, is if you're providing some compensation, that kind of is a signal of the level of buy-in that you might want from a stakeholder. But I definitely recommend taking another look at that spectrum to see some other examples of what those activities might be. Here, let me double check, I think. Oh, I see. Yeah. I think consulting, you're right. It is a bit lower. So I think here, okay, so the way, I guess, you can kind of work with different frameworks, but the way I see consult is I think is a little bit deeper, but here they're saying that, okay, we just care what you think. Whereas involving here is like, okay, we're taking more accountability toward that particular, toward that feedback that you're adding. And so this is sort of the like acting differently about that issue. Whereas like consulting, they're framing as like, we'll take your comment, but we're not necessarily going to sort of change our actions as a result of that.
Jasmine, did you see the comments that were just put in the chat?
Yeah, let me see Kelly's comment. So to your point, the configuration will likely change depending on how info is gathered to understand concerns, listening sessions, and where there are opportunities for groups to influence decision. Yes, that's another great point. Like maybe this configuration will change depending on like what stage of a process you're in, right? So if you are in kind of like a more exploratory phase, just trying to understand the landscape of things, that might look very different than like when you have a proposal and that's in front of a commission to decide what the final outcome will be. And so, yeah, I think you can kind of think about like if you were to put a plan together, maybe you have for each stage of the plan a different version of the matrix to be like, this is who we really want now, this is who we want later, or maybe you're convening a technical working group and you want to establish a matrix or a stakeholder mapping for that particular group of people. That's probably going to look very different than one that's more community focused. You might have more like consulting companies and engineers and the utility and other experts kind of reflected on that type of stakeholder map. Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for your participation in this. I'm going to go back to the slides, but hopefully that kind of gives you one concrete activity that you can do and adapt depending on what you're working on. And I just want to make sure, are you still able to see my slides, or did it stay on the stakeholder map whiteboard?
You
I
can see
can
your
see- I
slides.
can see them.
Okay, okay, great. Just making sure I didn't. Right. All right. So I just wanted to share a few resources that I think are really helpful for getting started in doing stakeholder engagement. And then some of the key takeaways are why I think you should refer to these resources. The first is a report by NREL, which provides a pretty nice list of best practices and lessons learned. And these are all from work that NREL has done. So very much grounded in experience, which I think is really important, especially working in kind of a more recent issues in the energy sector. And some of the best practices that I like to share from this include, and as we talked about earlier, doing your homework in preparation for community interaction, being humble, authentic, and honest in your interactions, respecting community agency, meeting the community where they are, and to democratize participation, which really just looks like making sure everyone kind of has an equal voice within, an equal voice to share their concerns and experiences. This next resource is particularly focused on public utility commissions and doing stakeholder engagement from that lens. So like for utilities or for the commissions themselves. But I think this framework is pretty applicable outside of that as well. And what it does is it just helps think through what are the key decisions that I might need to make when it comes to designing a type of public engagement with a utility. And so it walks through some things to think about with regard to the scope, the facilitation approach, engagement approaches, the meeting format, timeline, and engagement outcomes and follow-up. And I'll just maybe point specifically to the facilitation approach. Another thing that I think is really important, especially if you're working with a community or some group of stakeholders that might not have the most level of trust in those who are convening the engagement, is to think about who's actually facilitating it, whether that's going to be the utility itself, the agency itself, or having a complete third party. That could be someone from the community who's already a trusted voice, or someone who has a more neutral kind of perspective on the issue that's being discussed. So this report has a lot more information, but I recommend taking a look at that. And then lastly, this is one of my favorite tools for public engagement, and it's a very comprehensive toolkit with links to many other resources, but it really walks through, I think, the full life cycle of what community engagement could look like, and different strategies you can take. And I think it also really points to some important things like cultural competence, leadership, assessment, and I think is probably the most comprehensive resource that I've been able to find. So this is a great one. It's not specific to energy, but there's a lot of stuff that I think can carry over. And so I also wanted to see if anyone had other resources they wanted to share. It seems like there is one that's already in the chat around research fatigue. That definitely seems relevant. I think that came up when I mentioned engagement fatigue. Yeah, are there any others that folks may have that they would like to share with the rest of the group? And also with me, because I'm sure I could learn some other things as well. You can feel free to, continue to add those. But as you're doing that, I guess we can move on to questions. Are there, any questions folks have about stakeholder engagement, or maybe some best practices or things that you've learned from your own work that you think would be worthwhile for the other fellows to know?
I have purely a personal question, if that's okay.
Yes, yes.
It's honestly not much in terms of specifics, just how have you been enjoying your research?
Thank you for that question. I enjoy my research. I feel like I have a very interdisciplinary kind of span of my work. So I work with the Berkeley lab, but in addition to that, I have research outside of the lab, and I'm doing some work right now around this concept called civic imagination, which is very much grounded in community. But essentially what I'm doing is I'm doing some research on involving communities in San Francisco around essentially participatory visioning for the future, which includes energy and sustainability, but I'm sort of thinking about it a bit more broadly. Yeah, it's been fun.
Well, thanks for presenting today. Did a good
Yeah,
job.
of course. Thank you.
Said it was, sorry, civic
Civic imagination.
imagination.
Mhm.
Cool.
Okay, Tyler, feel free to ask your question.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes.
Ah, sweet. When you've shown that chart before from like ignore all the way to like defer, how do you choose? It seems like you should defer or try to defer all the time. Like always try to get to defer for everybody. But when do you decide like, oh, it's just too, that's been too much effort?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think it's really case specific. But I think it goes back to a comment someone made earlier about like how much capacity a community or stakeholder actually has to really own a full process, which often isn't a lot. And it also depends on how many or what type of resources your organization might have to like fully defer a process externally. Like if you have, the funding and the community is interested and has the time to do that, I think then there's an opportunity to defer. But I think if not, it often might look, you might want to fall a little bit further to the left and maybe think of just having a more collaborative approach that perhaps you are hiring a facilitator that's a third party. You're not fully going defer mode, but I think kind of a hybrid approach there where you can still like pull in elements of having folks from that community get involved in the planning, but it's not completely owned by them, because I think it can be a lot of time and effort to completely defer one of these decisions. And also you have to think about the requirements. Like sometimes these things have to be completely owned by the Public Utilities Commission or, someone else. So, there's also that baseline level of like making sure you're compliant with whatever regulations are in place.
I have a follow-up if that's all right.
Yes.
Um, if the capacity needs to be there, do you have successful examples of trainings that have been used in the past? A part of the program here is we're working on a sustainability program for the remote monitoring systems that are in villages, and I as we're developing that, I want to make sure it's as accessible as possible. And I was curious.
Yeah, that's a good question too. So I think, I don't want to make any definitive conclusions about how successful they are, but things that I think are innovative and interesting. One is a grant program out of the CPUC, the California Public Utilities Commission, that was, I think, maybe a year or two ago, and it was for nonprofits and other organizations to do this type of technical education around issues related to the commission. So like the commission provided those grants, but like they weren't owning that process. Like the organizations who are applying for their grants could kind of do that however they wanted to. Another example of, I think, sort of that hybrid approach is this exists in Hawaii, I believe, and a few other communities, like there's some in Colorado, but having folks who are sort of community liaisons that are hired by the agency, who are maybe from a community or have like expertise on like the experiences of a certain stakeholder group, who are kind of in between. And they are, they're aware of the goals of what the agency is, but can maybe have a little bit more trust, or like the communities have a bit more trust in them. And so they can kind of be this in between that are communicating between those different groups of folks and can do some more of that outreach directly, without some of the barriers that might come if you're just like a complete stranger who folks just aren't familiar with.
Along those lines, Jasmine, Portland General Electric, for their first round of integrated distribution system planning, brought in 2 community groups to great effect. I mean, there are a lot of learnings, you know, admittedly by the utility, mistakes made, but you know, get back up and do it again. And I think they found that that was very successful. So the community groups actually, you know, organized and led the meetings, and you know, they had the technical expertise from the utility, but that was super helpful. Also, I've been involved in several educational efforts to bring all the stakeholders sort of, you know, at least some base level to help engage in some of these more technical proceedings, like, you know, distribution system planning, where we're working, we're Berkeley Lab, we've got the technical expertise. We're not a party in the proceeding, we don't have any dog in the fight. And so we just provide like a series of educational webinars for stakeholders. Everybody can ask questions, you know, to sort of build the building blocks of the technical topics. So those are some examples.
No, thank you guys. I see overlap.
Awesome. Thanks for your question. Kelly also shared a couple more resources, look like from EPA and Headwaters Rural Capacity Index. And yeah, I think that the Headwater tool is really cool. I've taken a look at that as well. Yeah, I mean, there are a few, a couple examples of those types of indices that can also, I think, be really helpful for getting a more qualitative understanding of, you know, what starting conditions are kind of the background that you should think about before you design an engagement. Yeah, another one that I'm aware of, and this is maybe not super energy specific, but there's also a civic capacity index as well.
Okay, I think we're at time. Thanks so much, Jasmine. That was really helpful. And thanks to everybody for participating. I had fun just watching you do that whiteboard exercise. It was great.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
And Jasmine's email is right here, and you have access to all the slides, and the recordings will be posted next week on the Berkeley Lab website. Thank you. Thanks, Marty.
Great. Thanks, everyone.